So if you have an analytic mode of thinking where you try to create strong identities that you then analyze and predict, you create these so it does things like, for example, the creation of encyclopedias, right? The creation of dictionaries, all of this type of attitude where we want to fix the phenomena, define it, create a very strong boundary around it so we can analyze it, predict it, and all that. Well, that has corollaries, which are the problem, for example, of nation states. So nation states are born out of that thinking, and ethnic divisions, the way that we think of them in the modern age, are also born out of that division. Because just like we want to identify species of animals in order to analyze them and look at their behaviors, we do the same with humans, and we do the same with nations. So instead of having, broad empires with fuzzy borders and kind of no man's land and ambiguous spaces, we want to have nations with clear marginal lines, and we create maps, and we have maps that are, the ancient maps were basically Europe, Africa, Asia in like a flower pattern. And it has nothing to do, like, it has very little to do with the type of analytic thinking that we apply to the world now. And like you said, all the modern political movements are in some ways downstream from that, whether it is the libertarian who wants to be completely autonomous and free from all relationship to other beings, or whether it is the ethno-nationalist that wants to segregate himself and create this really tight, clear identity border around their identity, or whether it is the communist that in some ways is actually strangely akin to the libertarian, though with a different strategy. But so you can see the downstream from this type of thinking, you have all kinds of problems or political solutions that, although they fight amongst themselves, like you mentioned at the introduction, they are in some ways, they're not in some ways, they are just fruits of the same origin.
Well, you brought so many points which I would like to elaborate. I guess I will start with a quick point. I really liked your idea of borders because I think it's one of the most fascinating uh, element of modern reality when people treat borders as something both sacred, fixed, and natural, whereas historically there have been never any of these three things. Effectively, all borders in history are frontiers. They're constantly moving. They might not be
Yeah.
completely flexible, but it's always a movable line. Like there is, I think, maybe one of few borders in the world which like lasted for hundreds of years, and it's something like between a small Duke of Andorra and the rest of Spain, like in like peninsula. But generally speaking, borders are always something which is moved, and I think that's kind of the core weakness of rationalist thinking, which I think we can address it now, that it tries to freeze time. All of these kind of all of these ideologies, they try to freeze time. So let's say we find the perfect mapping of something, of a moment, being at the end of history of Fukuyama, or like liberal
Yeah.
end of history, communist, and then let's freeze it. It won't go any further. Nothing will ever happen. So let's freeze these borders. And when you ask the most simple question, why these borders? So why no movement? Then it falls apart.
Like if you want to understand, let's say, where the political movement is, you can see, just have to look at where the borders are absolute and unquestionable, and where the borders are all of a sudden treated as completely arbitrary and ridiculous, and as if not all the borders are actually have the same characteristic. But when you look at political movements, you can notice that when all of a sudden they start to treat certain borders as arbitrary and ridiculous, you think, oh, okay, now I see where the wind is shifting. I can kind of see. But like you said, what's interesting about that is, in some ways, the postmodern reaction to the modern thinking is in some ways a realization that identities have fuzziness, right? That I could say that if you try to eliminate the fuzziness, then at some point it has revenge on you, because you build it up in the borders. Then at some point it overwhelms the identity. You can't avoid it forever.
I absolutely agree. This revenge of the fuzziness, it's a great phrase I might borrow because that is a paradox.
Very difficult to see how we're going to solve the problem, because it's like once you start to crystallize things, right? The dream of abolishing the borders becomes almost necessary. So that's why it sounds contradictory, but the rationalism and the desire to let's say the analytic mode of creating all these nation states, it ultimately also leads to a dream of a one world government. Like it leads to the dream of something like communism, where the borders all dissolve, because the problem of the borders is a real problem. And if you ignore it, then you have World War One and you have World War Two. And it's like these are issues that the idea that went away, it's like we're not going to have that again, is so completely ridiculous as we see now. But then there's a dream of saying, well, then we should have all the borders dissolved, right? And so this is the funny thing about the movement of the Enlightenment, the movement of modernism, is that because of its dialectical structure, right, it tends to do that, and that's in some ways, I think that's one thing that people like Hegel or Marx intuited rightly, that process is in some ways inevitable for
Yeah, they think that nation state, for example, is an ally of local community, whereas historically nation state has never been an ally of local community. Historically, all nation states are literally created on the bones and blood of local communities, but they're sold as in a history version as on a contrary, something which fights to protect the local community from an oppressive empire, whereas the true master is kind of states associated, and it is this idea of Tower of Babel world without no borders. So, and that's what I think the paradox we're in, and that's why it's hard to have a conversation, because people rarely see this whole structure, at least the way I encounter. Maybe you see it differently.
That's the way that it's presented. It's like, oh, those horrible, dangerous ethno-nation states that are xenophobic, and they're all these things, and we accuse them, and they do all these things that are only for their own interest. We need a global interest. We need something that serves everyone, and so we're going to create this global structure that, with technology, will be capable of managing individuals here. I mean, that is the most, like you said, that's the most corrosive thing ever. You have this opposition, right, where the individual becomes more and more free, in parenthesis, and then the state becomes more and more powerful necessarily. And so that's why, that's why the strange coalition between rainbow coalition stuff and globalism, because it looks like, how do these two things fit together? Well, they completely fit together, because as you move towards idiosyncrasy, then you need the state. So it's like the idiosyncrasy becomes more and more pervasive, and therefore we need someone to protect all of us from each other, right? Because now we all hate each other.
It's the same, yeah, as ideal in this idiosyncratic moment, we have this famous, panopticon image. The one eye in the middle and every single individual in its own cell. Like, that's the most famous image of where it cannot not go. Like, there is no way of going it.
An absolute authoritarian world government is, I don't know if it's possible, but at least the dream of it is far more, like, the dream that people have of it is closer than what the Romans or the Persians had access to.
I see what you mean, and yeah, it is definitely closer, but I think here is a completely different pattern which is on our side.